And welcome to episode 3 in the Quickfire series that I'm putting together. This time we're talking about social attitudes, how Scottish and English people see the questions around social issues, electoral reform issues, to try and get into this idea of that what is what the SNP are suggesting in the pro-independence papers that have been published that we're looking through right now. To what extent is it the case that Scottish and English, the demos between the two countries are separating? That there's a distinct Scottish demos and a distinct English demos, and how they're seeing big cultural, social, political questions that are simply on divergent trajectories. Is this true? To what extent is it fair for the SNP to imply or claim that it is? Now, that's what we're going to look into today, and what I will show you using social attitude survey data from Britain and Scotland, and the data will be comparable, i.e. the Scottish survey, social attitude survey, and the British social attitude survey comparisons. That I will show you the data that's being compared is comparable because they use the same questions. So we can compare data and we can have some very interesting answers. The bottom line is any differences that do exist between Scotland and England in terms of public attitudes are marginal. They're merely matters of differences of degree. They should not be overstated where they do exist. Generally, there's not a lot of difference between how Scottish and English people see issues. Whether it's immigration, tend to be very, very consistent in terms of public opinion. When it comes to perspectives on electoral reform, there's a clear consensus emerging in Britain in favour of electoral reform, in particular in favour of proportional representation. There's not a lot of difference to be had there. On questions towards egalitarianism, there are interesting findings. That's a little bit more nuanced, but again, the bottom line, as I'll show you, is that the differences between Scotland and England is not to do with national identity. It's not to do whether to do, or is not down to the fact that you're Scottish or you're English. In fact, national identity has virtually nothing to do with the divergences that do exist. What does matter is educational level, attainment level, social class, voter age, in particular, party affiliation. In fact, that's the big issue where Scotland and England actually have the divergences, is party political affiliation. It's not down to national identity at all, i.e. whether you're born in Scotland, you become inherently more egalitarian. Buncombe, not true, and I'll prove it by showing you the receipts, the data. So let us begin, shall we? Now, we will start as we always do at the start. This is the document, Renewing Scotland's Democracy Through Independence. This is the claim, July 14th papers, again. This is it on the Scottish Government website. We're looking through here. Running throughout this document is a continual claim that the SNP are proffering up to us to analyse and to consider, is this issue here. I've highlighted it already. Scotland is already on a different democratic path from that being taken, but for the United Kingdom by the UK government. Now, throughout this document, there's this continual claim, a drumbeat, that Scotland is fundamentally different from England in its political aspirations. That's not the case, and I will show it to you. Now, for what I've highlighted here to be true, that Scotland is on a different democratic path from that of the UK government, two things need to be true for the SNP to be able to back that up. One, the SNP are arguing, they're definitely implying, that there are structural differences that are irredeemably different. What do I mean? Well, I'm meaning electoral systems, Holyrood versus Westminster. Now, it is fair to say that Holyrood is a proportional electoral system, and Westminster's not. It's first past the post. But for the SNP to be able to claim that we're on a different democratic path from the UK government, and this is an irretrievable difference, so we therefore need independence to renew our electoral system, i.e. only through independence can we reform things. The UK will never be reformable in this structural sense around systems, electoral systems and so forth. The problem is that it's just not true. If we consider, for example, this issue around electoral systems, here we have public attitudes Britain-wide on whether or not we should have proportional representation, public attitudes on reform of the electoral system. Now, if there was an irretrievable difference, irredeemable difference between Scottish and English people in their public attitudes towards the need for reform of the constitutional settlement in terms of the electoral system, we would not see a plural majority or a plurality in favour of proportional representation. Because England has the bigger population, we would see a skew in favour of first past the post. But when you look at this data I'm showing you here, sourced from copious amounts of polling data that's comparable. It's asked, all of these polling companies have asked questions around support or opposition to proportional representation. So the data is comparable between the polling. The question wording is consistent and we can compare. What do we see? Since 2019, majorities or pluralities continually in favour, support for proportional representation. So, difference between Scotland and England? What difference? There's a clear public perception across the whole of the United Kingdom in favour of structural reform to the political systems. No difference at all. Why is that important? Well, if the UK is irredeemable, it's unreformable, we cannot renew our democracy, we cannot get to a point where we have pure and only proportional representation. We cannot get rid of first past the post. We cannot get rid of all of these political systems that we wish to be done with. The argument there is because Westminster is unreformable, but public opinion across the whole of the United Kingdom supports reform. In particular, comes down either by majority or plurality in favour of proportional representation. So that's a big shot through the SNP's argument there. Furthermore, we know that the Westminster system is structurally reformable. After all, we've seen the rise of devolution in Scotland and Wales in the 1990s by the Blair Labour government. We saw House of Lords reform, the hereditary peers getting the caboodle kicked out of the upper chamber. So it is reformable. The system can be reformed, has been reformed in the past, can continue to be reformed, and there's a public attitude across the whole of the United Kingdom in favour of reform of the electoral system. So this idea that we're on divergent, different democratic paths, bunkum. It's just not true. Maybe we would be better spending our time trying to build Britain-wide political appetite for reform, or rather the political realization at a party political level for the appetite to be for reform to be realized. The appetite is there. It's the political parties that don't represent it well enough. But the SNP are not interested in building a Britain-wide campaign for electoral reform, like we saw in episode 2 of the Quickfire series. Just like the SNP never cared about devolution historically, never wished it to work, they certainly are not interested in reforming the electoral system. In working to ensure the political parties actually represent the British appetite for reform that is there across the whole of the British Isles. The SNP are not interested in realising that, because that would be making the UK work. The SNP have a vested interest in arguing that only renewal can come through independence. It's the only way. That's just not true. We can see electoral reform in Britain is possible, has happened in the past, can happen again. The issue is around political parties not representing the voters' perceptions well enough. But that's something that was ever thus. That's not particularly an argument in favour of tearing down the constitution in favour of separation. Now, let us keep going. Then also, when we look at this, Scotland is on a different democratic path from that being taken in Britain by the British government. This is also an implicit claim that the Scottish demos and the English demos are politically divergent. We're on different democratic paths. Different democratic paths. Are we? Not on the basis of any evidence that I can find. This is, again, the spectre of Scottish exceptionalism. This idea that Scottish people by birth are inherently more egalitarian. Bunkum. I'll show you the data to prove that that's bunkum and not true at all. This is this horrible spectre of Scottish exceptionalism and the idiotic nonsense of we're odd Jock Tamson's bairns. Absolute nonsense. The idea that Scotland is somehow more egalitarian inclined by virtue of being Scottish. This is nonsense, and we can start to see why it's nonsense. Let us start with this issue of social identity and egalitarianism. I'm going to show you this. This is from by Sir John Curtis, the psephologist to the stars, the maestro of the art of public attitudes and polling. And this is from October 29th, 2020, only a couple of years ago. And what it's analysing is Scottish and English people, Scotland and England as countries, nations, on the question of egalitarianism. Is Scotland more egalitarian than England? This is the question. What does Sir John Curtis and his research and data tell us? It is often argued that Scotland is more left-wing than England. After all, the relative weaknesses of the Conservative Party north of the border would seem a clear testament to that being the case. And the claim, which has often been made by SNP spokespersons, nationalists, fits one of the key arguments that the party presents in favour of independence. That is, that for so long as it's part of the Union, Scotland is always at risk of having the realisation of its preferences stymied by a less progressive views of those living south of the border, i.e. English people are holding us back from being more egalitarian. That's what the SNP, that's what the nationalists continue to argue. Now, what does the data say? Well, let's have a look. There are some differences. For example, people in Scotland are more likely than their counterparts in England to feel it is wrong that people on higher incomes can buy better education than those on lower income. It's the 45% Scotland to 34%. So there's a gap, but it's by degree. It's not particularly dramatic. We're not talking 60-30 here, or whatever, you know, these are not particularly pronounced. There is a gap, similar gap, between when the same question is asked about healthcare. 42% in Scotland think it is wrong compared with 32% in England. It's different. There's a difference of degree, but not dramatic. Scotland's somewhat more egalitarian streak also comes through when people are asked about taxation, blah, blah, blah. So yes, there are divergences between the two nations, but they're not particularly dramatic. You can and are in danger of exaggerating it. What does Sir John Curtis say exactly? Yet, these figures also reveal that the differences between the two nations are but ones of degree. On both sides of the border, most people think that the distribution of income is unfair. In both countries, a majority do not necessarily think that being able to buy better education or healthcare is wrong. And in both places, over half do not think that taxes on high earners are too low. So in the overview, they're very similar, Scottish and English attitudes and the social issues around egalitarianism. And whilst there is a slight tendency more towards egalitarianism in Scotland, you really should not over-egg it. They're actually very consistent. There's not a lot of difference. The differences that do exist are mere differences of degree, not enough to support the SNP's claims. That's a very significant finding. And here we see what's more. In short, the image that emerges from the research is that Scotland is far from being at odds with England in its dislike of inequality and is only a little bit more inclined to do something about it. So Scotland and England tend to see issues of inequality the same. There's the same amount of dislike for inequality. It's just that Scottish people are a bit more inclined to do something about it. That inclination to do something more about it connected to Scottish people being more egalitarian on the basis that we're Scottish? Well, we can look at that. Here's the actual chapter in question. Let's have a look. Oh, look, what does it say exactly? However, these dissimilarities primarily reflect differences in party political affiliation rather than whether someone lives in either Scotland or England. Let me just clarify all of that. Scotland is slightly more socially democratic than England. True. But this is a difference of degree. It's not, and particularly dramatic, should not be exaggerated. And on the big overviews, dislike of inequalities, Scotland and England are very similar. So similar that you could say they're equivalent. Furthermore, where these divergences do exist, Scotland being more inclined to do something about inequalities than in England, this is not connected to national identity. It is not to do with whether you're born or live in Scotland. It's to do with party political affiliation. So no Scottish exceptionalism. No, we're all Jock Tamson's bairns. Bunkum. It's nothing to do with Scotland being in the ether, inherently more egalitarian on the basis that we're the bonny wee land of Scotland. This is nonsense. It's to do with party political affiliations, the party political histories and heritage. You think Red Clydeside in the west coast of Scotland. You know, it's about party politics. It's not to do with whether you're Scottish or English, because you can actually compare Scotland with regions of England in the north of England, and you see exceptional similarities about the dislike for social inequalities and the desire to do something about it. So the SNP here are playing a political game that's not supported by the evidence. We're not irredeemably divergent political cultures at all on the issue of social inequalities. But let's keep going. So let's keep going. Responsibility for reducing social inequality. So who should do something about it and how well is it being fixed? Even though there are significant differences between people living in Scotland and England in terms of perceptions of social fairness, the picture is less clear-cut when it comes to views on what Britain should do about it. Oh, so there are divergences, but they're not connected to whether you're Scottish or English. It's connected to political affiliation, remember, where these differences do exist. It's nothing to do with you're Scottish or English. It's to do with whether you vote Labour or Tory or SNP or Green or whatever. It's party politics. And wrapped in with that would be age, demographics, educational attainment levels, etc., and so forth. But when we take these divergences into account, there is a consensus in England and Scotland that the government should be responsible for minimizing the gap between the richest and poorest. So there's a consistent picture in terms of dislike for inequalities. There's a consistent picture that government should be responsible for doing something about it. But the difference is Scottish people are more inclined than English people to think the government is actually failing to do enough. i.e., Scottish people are more inclined to do something about it. Because why? Because they don't think government is being successful enough in fixing social inequalities. But this is, again, not whether you're Scottish or English, it's connected to party political affiliation. That's the key takeaway that the SNP will never tell you, they'll never admit to you, because that shoots a hole through what all Jock Thompson's bairns. That shoots a hole through the SNP's claim that we're on different democratic paths. Are we? Not according to the social attitudes survey data. You know, in short, I'll quote it again. In short, the image that emerges from the research of Sir John Curtis is that Scotland is far from being at odds with England in its dislike of inequality. England and Scotland, far from being at odds, are actually in agreement. So England isn't holding us back from being able to do something about these problems. Scottish and English people agree in terms of our dislike of inequalities, because it's not a question of nationalism, national identity. It's a question of party, political affiliation, social class, educational attainment level, blah, blah, blah. The only difference is that Scottish people are more inclined to think that the government is failing to do enough. It's not being successful enough at Westminster in fixing it. Scottish people have more of an appetite to see more change. But this is about party politics now. It's not about a fundamental difference of opinion between Scottish and English people. We're not talking about divergent democratic paths. Far from it. So that's social. Now, so that's me demonstrated that in terms of the big issues around egalitarianism, Scotland is slightly more socially democratic than England, but it's a difference of degree. You should not overstate it. These differences that do exist are questions around party political affiliation, etc., not national identity. Furthermore, on questions of dislike of inequality, Scottish and English people are coming out the same in their dislike. The polling, the social attitudes, there's not a fag paper of difference on that. The difference comes in that English people tend to give government the benefit of the doubt more. Scottish people don't think government is doing enough to tackle inequalities. And again, it's a difference of degree. Don't overstate it. You're at risk of exaggerating. So that's social inequalities. Let's do immigration. That's a big one. The SNP talk about that a lot. It's connected to their rhetoric on Brexit. Oh, you know, Scotland needs to be in the EU. We need more immigration. Ironic that the SNP argue that we need independence to have our own immigration policy to get more inward immigration into Scotland. It's ironic because what the SNP are saying is we're happy to have more continental Europeans come to Scotland, but we want a border with England and we want less English and Welsh people being able to smoothly ingress and egress in and out of Scotland. We want free movement for the EU and Scotland, but we don't want freedom of movement, particularly with Scotland and the rest of Britain. It's a bizarre thing, but I don't particularly want to get into it. Point is Scottish and English people divergent? Are Scottish and English people divergent in terms of attitudes to immigration? This underpins quite a lot as well. Well, let's have a look. What we will see is that we are fundamentally not divergent in our opinions. This is from the website What Scotland Thinks. This is using data, British social attitudes data and the Scottish social attitudes data survey by Ian Montague and Sir John Curtis again. So we're going a little bit further back. This is not 2020 analysis. This is 2017. Now, why 2017, Dean? Well, because it's not always possible to compare British and Scottish social attitude survey data each time it happens, because you need to have the questions the same, the methodology has to be the same. You have to be able to compare the data. Sometimes you can't, sometimes you can. Just so happens that in 2017, there was coordination that allows us to come to some interesting revelations surrounding Scottish and English attitudes about immigration. So the data is robust, methodology is consistent. This is not flimsy. What does Sir John Curtis and Professor Montague find? The proportion of people who view the economic and cultural consequences of immigration positively is similar, both sides of the border. Oh, so the number of people in Scotland and the number of people in England who view immigration as having economic and cultural consequences that are positive is similar, not different. This similar to the point where it's not, there are no meaningful differences. We have the numbers here. In Scotland, people who believe immigration is good for the British economy, 46%, then believe it is bad, 17%. What about England and Wales? Well, in England and Wales, it's 47%, more by 1% more English and Welsh people think immigration is good than bad. 16% in England and Wales think it's bad. So 46% of Scots at this time period of data think that immigration is good for the economy. 46% of Scots think it's good. 47% of English and Welsh think it's good. So no meaningful differences, although by 1%, the English and the Welsh think immigration more positively than we do. How about that? So much for bonnie Scotland's inherently more egalitarian outlook. In Scotland, more people think immigration enriches British culture by 43% than undermines it 20%. Again, the picture in England is very similar. 43%, the same, believe immigration has a positive impact upon British culture, and 23% believing it's negative. It's virtually the same. So there's no differences in how Scottish and English people view the positive immigration in terms of it being a positive culturally and economically. It's the same proportion. There's no divergence based on national identity that we can find. So different democratic path, not in terms of social egalitarianism, particularly, certainly not in terms of immigration. The relationship, let's continue. The relationship between attitudes towards immigration and demographic characteristics is also similar between Scotland and England and Wales. On both sides of the border, young people are more likely than older age groups to regard it positively in terms of economics and culture. So what do we say? It's about age, not national identity. We've seen in terms of social inequalities that it's about party political as opposed to national identity. Now on immigration, we're saying it's about age, not national identity. It's not about whether you're Scottish or English. It's about how old you are. That's the big cleavage in terms of how you view immigration. And in terms of social inequalities, it's about which party you vote for, not about whether you're Scottish and English. There is no different democratic path because we're more egalitarian by virtue of being Scottish. This is nationalist bunkum. It's the nonsense of Scottish exceptionalism, and it's a dragon that we need to slay. In both Scotland and England and Wales, those who have higher educational qualifications are more likely than those with fewer or no formal qualifications to see immigration as having positive impact. So it's not about national identity. It's about your educational attainment level. So it's about age. It's about educational attainment level. It's about political affiliation. At no point in any of this social attitudes data is it about whether you're Scottish or English. There are no meaningful divergences of opinion whether you're Scottish, or, excuse me, or English. So it's here we are, party political affiliation. There are, however, differences across Britain, differences between England and Wales in the relationship between attitudes towards immigration and how people vote. Now, this is very significant because, before we dig into this, this is the key point. The SNP will argue, of course, Scotland and England see these issues differently. Of course, we're on a different democratic trajectory. Our democracies are moving apart. After all, you can just see by the fact that the vast majority of Scots vote SNP or Labour or a Scottish Liberal Democrat, and English people tend more to vote Conservative. In England, Labour have not won the popular vote in England since 2001. So of course, we're in different democratic trajectories, Dean. Well, no, because the issue here is how voters who see these issues on immigration the same virtually, I've just showed you the data, the difference becomes into how these voters mirror their attitudes and the political parties. So it's about party political differences, how the parties are seen, not how the issues are seen. So let's dig into this, because this is the bit, this is the nuance the SNP will never admit or tell you about. Those who vote for the Conservatives or Labour in Scotland are less likely than those supporters of those parties in England and Wales to hold a favourable view of the economic consequences of immigration. Let's just unpack that a little bit, shall we? Those who vote for the Tories or Labour in Scotland are less likely than those who support Labour or Conservative in England and Wales to hold a favourable view of the economic consequences of immigration. So if you vote Tory, let's put that simply. If you vote Tory or you vote Labour in Scotland, you're less likely than a Tory or a Labour voter in England to have a favourable view of immigration. Less likely to hold a favourable view of the economic consequences. So English Labour and English Tory voters are actually more inclined to hold a favourable view of immigration in terms of its economic consequences than their counterparts in Scotland. That's something the SNP don't like to ever admit. That's a very interesting finding. Labour and Liberal Democrat voters in Scotland are less likely than those supporters of those parties in England and Wales to take a positive view of the cultural consequences of immigration. Oh, if you vote Labour or Lib Dem in Scotland, you're less likely than an English Lib Dem or an English Labour voter to hold a positive view of the cultural consequences. So let's just pause there. If you vote Labour, if you vote Lib Dem, if you vote Conservative in Scotland, you're less likely to hold a favourable view of the benefits, economic and cultural, of immigration than your counterparts in England voting for both of those parties. So the divergence is the parties, not the overall public attitudes. It's how the voters associate each of the parties with the issue. Whereas if you're SNP, voting SNP, what we can say very clearly is the SNP voters generally have a relatively favourable view of the consequences of immigration. So it's about party political affiliation. It's about how the voters wed their very consistent views on immigration in England and Scotland, and how that differs based on how they vote. But the attitudes underlining it, the social attitudes of immigration are not what's different. It's how that links up with political affiliation. So there's no Scottish exceptionalism to count here. Let us finish up on this. So also quite interesting. In Scotland, there is no systemic relationship between national identity and the perceptions of the consequences of immigration, in contrast to the position in England. So, put simply, there is no systemic, meaningful, sustained relationship between being Scottish and your attitude to immigration. There is no relationship that is systemic between those two things. So there is no Scottish exceptionalism here at all. Again, we can see that in the data, despite what the bunk on the SNP claim here. Oh, well, we're on a different democratic path. Westminster can't be reformed. We're all shucks. We're all just too different. No, we're not. No, we're not at all. At no point has that been reinforced in the data. 43% of those in England who say they're English, not British, believe that immigration is bad for the economy, compared with only 17% of those who feel British, not English, or more British than English. Ah, so why is there a systemic relationship between national identity and perceptions of immigration in England? This is the rise of English nationalism that we need to count for here. Those who feel English, not British, there's a clear connection, a systemic relationship between saying you're English, not British, and having a particular view on immigration. But that is not true in Scotland. It's not true for people who feel themselves English and British, or British more than English. So that's a caveat that's interesting and might have, in the longer term, significant consequentials. But this is the English question, what of England, I suppose. But it's a very marginal thing. It's restricted to those who would say they're English, not British. Most English people, from the data I've seen, would say they're English and British, or British more than English. But the rise of English nationalism is to be accounted for. But just to repeat, there is no systemic relationship between being Scottish and having a particular view of immigration, despite what the SNP would like you to believe. So, what can we say? In Scotland, attitudes towards the economic and cultural implications of immigration among those who say they are more Scottish than British are similar to those who identify as more British than Scottish. So there is no national identity cleavage at all. It's just not present. It's just not present. So let's round all of this up. I went on far too long. What can we say? The question that SNP are putting forward is that Scotland can only renew its democracy on the issues of the electoral system, realizing the political world that we would like to see on issues around egalitarianism, social inequalities, immigration. We need to be independent because, oh shucks, we're just diametrically, or at least significantly diverging from how English people are seeing it. Not true. I've just showed you it's not true. Where differences do exist, it's a question of party political affiliation. It's a question of age and educational attainment. It's not a question of national identity. It's just not. Scottish and English people tend to see things very similarly. So far from Scotland is already on a different democratic trajectory. No, we're not. It's just an issue around how voters in Scotland and England who see the issues of, say, immigration very similarly, just to take the example of immigration, how they link that up to how they vote. But it's a question of voter habit. It's not a question of Scottish people being inherently more fair-minded. It's not a question of Scottish people being inherently more egalitarian. Can we please put an end to this bunkum of, oh, we're all Jock Hampson's bairns, we're inherently more communitarian minded in Scotland, oh, shucks, by virtue of being Scottish, we're more egalitarian. No, we're not. This is tawdry nationalist Scottish exceptionalism. And I've just showed you this social attitude survey data that disproves it, the polling data that disproves it. So, with that, we will end episode 3. I hope you found that engaging and enlightening. As always, down the bottom of the Substack page, all of my links will be present, so you can read the references and the material I linked to for yourself. As always, don't take my word for it. take the expert's word for it. And I'm happy to provide my notes and references of everything I cite in these videos so that you can argue with me, or if you think I misrepresent or overstate a particular part of it, you can come back on me. I always present my links. Reference materials there for you. So until next time, adieu.